Well, hello and welcome. For the last several months, in fact, the big focus has been on the process of India acquiring vaccines, as many vaccines as possible. But the key issue over here is the pace of vaccination and also whether the vaccines themselves work as effectively against mutant strains as we would hope that they do. There's new research which has now actually come from the United Kingdom which suggests that there is an extent of effectiveness. Is this as effective as we'd like it to be? And what about the future and booster doses? Well, we've got lots of questions and we've really got perhaps the finest virologist in the country, Dr. Gagandeep Kang, professor at CMC Vellore, somebody who's been very closely helping in the fight against COVID in India. Thanks, Dr. Kang, very much for being with us. So we've got several questions and the first one is this. Now, new data from the United Kingdom, this is just data which has come out yesterday, shows that 2 doses of AstraZeneca, in other words, what we call Covishield here, has a 60% effectiveness against B.1.617.2. That was the variant first discovered in India. In simple terms, is that good effectiveness after 2 doses, or would ideally we have liked something better?
Well, obviously, we'd like the perfect vaccine, the one where you take 1 shot and it protects you forever against all variants. But I will bring us back to about a year ago when WHO developed what's called a target product profile for a vaccine against SARS-CoV-2. What we were hoping for then was a vaccine that would have at least 50% efficacy that lasted for at least 6 months. And every vaccine that we have so far exceeds that target. What we are seeing is that with a number of the variants, the efficacy is less with 1 or 2 doses of the vaccine than, than against the strain for which these vaccines were originally designed. Now, does this mean that we will need booster doses? Does this mean that we will have to revaccinate individuals or that we will have to design new vaccines in order to protect against these variants? These are things that we are still figuring out. But so far, from what we have learned, the vaccines work. They work very well. And it is possible to make them very quickly. So would we like for a vaccine to be 90% instead of 60%? Yes, but 60% is not bad at all.
Which brings me to my next question. Should the gap in Covishield doses be reduced? Recently, we extended them based on the data we are seeing in the United Kingdom.
Well, the data from the United Kingdom is based on a 12-week gap. So they started their program in December with a 12-week gap between the AstraZeneca and the Pfizer vaccines. So what we are seeing today is that when you give 2 doses of either the Pfizer or the AstraZeneca vaccine, you get pretty good protection against the B.1.1.7 variant as well as the B.1.617.2 variant, right? And this is above 60% with 2 doses. They actually don't have data for a shorter interval because they haven't used a shorter interval. They are now going to switch to shorter intervals because they have finished vaccinating their priority groups with the first dose of the vaccine. So currently there are no data that tell us that 8 weeks is better than 12. We will learn that, and these are experiments in a sense that are natural experiments run in the immunization program that will yield data. Does this apply 1-for-1 to India?
Dr. Kang,
Sorry, go ahead.
As I understand it, after a single dose, the data in the United Kingdom for AZ, and in fact for Pfizer as well, shows less than 40% efficacy. Therefore, again, if we were to bring forward the second dose, given that efficacy is still quite low for the first one, wouldn't that protect our population more? I understand the point about numbers of vaccines available, but I'm just asking in terms of protecting our population.
No, this is a really important question, but the data that have been presented are for all symptomatic infection. What we really want is vaccines that protect against severe disease and death. And previously we have had data from the UK showing that we get about 80% protection against severe disease and death, even among the elderly. So what it requires now is for us to study this data more carefully and understand what exactly we are talking about. What is it? Is it all symptomatic disease? How much protection against mild disease? How much protection against severe disease? And the other thing that I think is really important for India to consider is that before we went into the second wave, we already had parts of cities with over 50% seroprevalence, and in rural areas 20-odd% based on the ICMR sero surveys that have been countrywide. Now, what does this mean? If it is about two exposures to the virus, one being a natural infection and the second being a vaccine, will that behave like 2 doses of vaccine in the UK? We actually don't know that at this time. And I think it's really urgent that we try to get this information on what is vaccine effectiveness against people who are known to have been infected previously and have got 1 dose, as well as those known to not be infected previously who have got 2 doses. We don't have that information at this time.
Yeah. What about real life data available in India? We've now been doing this for several months. The Indian Army has vaccinated approximately 99% of all soldiers. The Indian Armed Forces, I presume, Air Force, Navy would have. So, there's a lot of robust data over there in terms of the number of infections they have post-vaccination. Number 2, I'm told the Max chain has done real-life studies as well. Just under 14,000 frontline workers in hospitals. The numbers there are very encouraging. 1 doctor has passed away. And yet the IMA is concerned because they point out that they've got data of doctors who haven't been fully vaccinated, and the number of fatalities have been larger. Apollo has also done a study, not so much about the second phase as yet, but certainly about that period between the first and the second wave. So based on all of this data, are we in a position to comment on how effective the vaccines are on COVID?
Actually, vaccine effectiveness studies are not that challenging. What you need is numbers. What you've described with the army and, the armed forces and the hospital chains are groups that were immunized in January and February, and therefore data from March onwards should be sufficient to give us efficacy data. You've also kind of left out the police and the railways, which presumably will also have a fair amount of good information. But I think we really need every source we can get, and we should be trying to measure efficacy wherever we can.
Okay, you briefly spoke about a single dose vaccine. So let's talk about that. That's in fact my next question to you. Given the pace of vaccination and the incredible burden of population we have in our country, are single dose vaccines the solution to our vaccine woes?
So I definitely think that we should try and get 1 dose of vaccine to as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. And I think we should do that preferably in an age descending strategy. And then we can go around with a second dose if we need it. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine has a single dose strategy. The Covishield vaccine we know gives a reasonable amount of protection with just 1 dose. Will that hold for inactivated vaccines? That is not so clear. I think with Covaxin we should at least initially go with 2 doses. And given that some data are emerging with Sinopharm, which is also an inactivated vaccine, indicating that protection might not be as good against the variants, I think we should be thinking about what a booster dose for that might look like, and also trying to figure out, do we need that booster or not? This is the phase where we really need vaccine research in large populations.
And absolutely. Now Sputnik is saying that if talks with the regulator are successful in June, then they would introduce what they call Sputnik Light, which is essentially just the first dose of a 2-dose vaccine. And they say the efficacy is very high. And if this were to be introduced, it would be India's first single-dose vaccine. Again, given our time constraints, isn't that a very good prospect for us? Your views on that?
I think Sputnik and Johnson & Johnson are vaccines to be considered. But given the many issues that have surrounded Sputnik's release of data, including to regulators, I'd really like to advise that when we start to use a vaccine, we absolutely, before we start, build in the mechanisms to assess effectiveness of those vaccines. Once we have that real world data, we can modify the strategies that we have implemented.
Okay. The IMF a few days back, and you would have seen this fantastic document that they've come out with, $50 billion can end the world's problems in a finite period of time. But one of the points, and I found this really interesting, is they said that the World Health Organization's body, which actually looks at the manufacture of vaccines, is not a very inclusive body. That this is composed primarily of developed countries, not developing countries. And therefore the pace of clearing vaccines from Russia, India and China is slow and therefore problematic. Is there a need for the WHO to speed up that process, either say yes or no?
I think it's very important to recognize that the WHO relies on regulators to make the first decision about vaccines. And then it takes what the regulators have done and reviews that again. And if it has any doubts about the regulatory process, then it decides to do some of its own due diligence. And this might include a WHO site visit to the manufacturing facilities. So I think that when it comes to regulatory processes, we should be very careful and we should hold safety to the highest standards. You really need to worry about safety. You need to look at data. For me, the kind of approach that the FDA takes, where they do their own independent review of the data that is submitted by companies, that's what we should be aiming for. Unfortunately, at the moment, we don't necessarily have the skills or a regulatory agency that is the same size as the FDA. But I don't agree that WHO should cut corners.
Right, no, absolutely. I was just asking about speeding up the process. I take your point. A lot of companies and a lot of people are looking at the future of vaccinations, and they're looking at a single dose nasal vaccine. Codagenics from SII has to go through the process. Bharat is also looking at a single dose nasal vaccine, which they've got a tie-up with, I think, an American company. Given the speed of actually vaccinating somebody, the easy transportability, and I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, you may not necessarily have to wait after getting a dose. Is this something that's very good for us from a time standpoint?
In theory, yes. In practice, we've had 2 attempts to make nasal vaccines before. One has resulted in a licensed product, and that is influenza vaccines. And in some seasons, we found that the nasal influenza vaccine was practically no use when injectable influenza vaccines worked. The second was an attempt to do a nasal measles vaccine, where a study was done by WHO in Pune. That vaccine worked but failed to meet the criteria for non-inferiority. So that vaccine was not taken forward. So we have not had incredible success with nasal vaccines in the past, but given that the injectable vaccines for SARS-CoV-2 are working much better than vaccines for any other respiratory virus that we have studied so far, maybe we will be lucky with nasal vaccines as well.
Okay. So my next question to you, assuming we get the vaccines in the numbers that we seek, is door-to-door step vaccination essential to India's plans to administer the vaccine?
I certainly hope that we will move to that. I think it's very important to recognize that people who cannot get to a vaccination facility are amongst the most vulnerable. There is a reason that they can't get there. And if we can get the vaccines to them, then that's absolutely the right thing to be doing.
Do you have any concerns? Do you believe, for example, in areas there needs to be an ambulance which is kept, that doctors need to be alert to adverse reactions, etc., etc.?
So there is a risk of anaphylaxis with the mRNA vaccines, and in fact quite likely with every vaccine, which is a very severe allergic reaction. Usually these reactions occur within 30 minutes of the injection being given. So as long as we can make sure that there are medical staff that are in attendance in the region for the first 30 minutes, and for anything that occurs after that time, there is a reporting mechanism that is available. I think we should be good to go with the door-to-door strategy.
Okay. Okay. My next question to you is this. Is mixing vaccines in the context of a booster dose a solution?
Not necessarily just for a booster dose. We could be looking at it for a primary series as well. So there is some very interesting data that has come again from studies in the UK, where they mixed the AstraZeneca and the Pfizer doses and showed that in terms of minor safety events, they were slightly increased, but that the immune responses that you got with mixing two different platforms together resulted in really, really good, strong responses. So we might want to think about having a mix and match strategy even for a primary immunization. Obviously, the vaccine companies will not be happy with that because that cuts their sales in half for their product. But the other thing that's also very interesting is that there have been studies done with the mRNA vaccines where people who received the primary series of 2 doses of the same vaccine then got either a third dose of the original vaccine or got a third dose of a vaccine that was based on the B.1.617.2 variant, and it resulted in a broadening of the immune response. So these kinds of data are really important, and they show us that protection against variants is very, very feasible. So we just need to make sure that we optimize injection or vaccination strategies in order to be able to do that.
Okay. What does the safety data show on vaccines for children?
There have been studies that have been done by various vaccine companies on children, and so far there are no concerns, which is pretty much as you would expect it to be. The only concerns that we really have with any of the vaccines are the ones that have shown up after the vaccines are used in millions of people. And for the safety studies done in children, those studies are done in thousands and not in millions. I don't expect that children will have any safety events that are different from those that have been seen in adults. And those are essentially the ones we know about: anaphylaxis with the mRNA vaccines and the TTS, or the thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome, which is being very, very rarely seen with the AstraZeneca vaccine and the J&J vaccine.
One final question to you, and it's this. We have a vaccine shortage now in the country. We are trying to ramp up production. Covishield, Covaxin, Sputnik, when available, will not be available at this rate in the real numbers that we seek. So therefore, what are the options for India other than to import vaccines? And if that is a solution, shouldn't we be doing that right now, where we buy up vaccines, bring them in as and when they are available? Buy. We've not done that in the past. But is that something we need to do now?
Aren't we a little late to the table on this one? The rest of the world has been buying vaccines at risk for a year. So what's the supply that is available in the market for us to go now and say we want to buy vaccines? I think we should be doing deals with our own manufacturers. There are multiple manufacturers that are ready to make vaccines that are in clinical trials. We don't have the results of their studies now, but why are we not doing at-risk investments in those manufacturers? And some of them will play out. These vaccines have had a really high success rate. And if you can go to Zydus Cadila, Biological E, all the companies that are making vaccines, which will be ready in the latter part of this year, tell them, ramp up your production, make as much as you can. If your trials are successful, we'll take everything you've got. I think we'll get more doses that way.
And that needs an appetite, ma'am, for failure as well. When America did warp speed and invested $10 billion in March last year, they took into account that some of that money would be lost. And they were okay with that. And this was when Trump was in power, who was an anti-vaxxer. So do we have that appetite to take, a financial risk? Because in a situation like this, if you're not prepared to do that, some would suggest that, it's a lost cause almost.
Well, I definitely think we should be taking that risk. And if we do, it sets us up well for the future as well. Because you establish a precedent where you will be willing to invest in innovation, knowing that innovations will not always succeed. But I have no idea how this is going to play out.
All right, ma'am, it's always a pleasure speaking to you. Half an hour packed with information. Thank you so much for being with us. Vaccinate, vaccinate, vaccinate. We say that every night. We'll say this once again on this program. Let's hope the vaccines get here in the numbers that we want. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.